Wednesday evening for you. I am planning to finish by 8 o'clock, but my actual talk will go for much less than that so we can really address more questions if they come up. So, we're going to be covering composting, Bokashi, and worm farming. You might not be familiar with all those different techniques, but they all are three different ways of converting what might be waste into something that's just absolutely fabulous for your garden. And I just cannot stress how important that sort of stuff is. So my name's Marie Chavarella. I'm from My Green Garden. It's my own small business. I've been chatting to people about compost since I reckon about 2007, so do the maths there. But from compost comes beautiful gardens, and beautiful gardens grow fantastic food. And once you're growing fantastic food, you need to learn how to cook it and preserve it. So I sort of cover, My Green Garden covers all those facets. But really, when we're talking about back to basics, it's all about composting. And there's two adjuncts as well. So when we're talking about recycling organic waste at home, after I've gone through these three methods, you might think, well, one of them is going to work better for us or not. And apparently Brimbank City Council and a lot of councils around Melbourne nowadays as well will offer the FOGO, the Food Organics, Garden Organics. So in Manningham, we got it about I'm in Donvale, we got it about 2 or 3 years ago, and I absolutely love it. I still compost because I know the value of composting, but those FOGO bins cope with the bits and pieces that can't go into the compost, or the worm farm, or the Bokashi buckets. I also have chooks, and sometimes they can cope with all those other added leftovers. So let's have a look at which method suits your situation. But why bother? If the council is doing your FOGO for you, is getting rid of those organic scraps, why bother composting? Well, first of all, you are providing fantastic enrichment for your soil. And particularly if you are growing vegetables or even fruit trees, but vegetables in particular, you're going to notice the difference. Compost itself, when added to the soil, let's not consider it a fertilizer, but it adds organic matter back to your soil. Because every time you pull up a carrot, or you pick a tomato, or you take some peaches off your tree, you're removing effectively something that's come out of the soil and has been transformed into the food we eat. And you'll notice this if you have raised garden beds, that after every season that level of soil goes lower and lower. It's because you've been removing it. We need to put something back in. Now you could use the method of what's called chop and drop. Get those carrot tops if you're not going to use them, chop them down and just leave them in the garden. Eventually, quite naturally, they will break down and add organic matter to your soil. But if you're not that style of gardener, you've got to take things away. Let's learn how to compost so we can put things back into the soil. So in effect, I call it gold for your garden, or black gold for your garden, because it makes an enormous difference to the fertility of your soil. In that compost, you can't see it, but there are billions of microorganisms, microflora and microfauna. So little creepy crawlies we can't see, but also bacteria and soil fungi and things that are necessary really for the health of your soil. It's that compost, when it breaks down further in your soil, it acts as the go-between between the minerals that are just naturally in your soil and the plant's roots and their ability to take them up. So that compost, further breakdown in your soil, becomes stuff called humus, and that humus acts as that conduit between, even if you've got clay soils, you've got lots of minerals in there, that gets taken up by the plants that way. So a soil that's rich in organic matter, such as compost, will result in a much more fertile soil. That's why I compost. I do it. I grew up composting. I was lucky. I grew up in a family that composted. My parents and my grandparents as well had large gardens. If it wasn't growing food, it was made into concrete basically. The rest of it was food. And I saw them always composting. They would always save all those bits and pieces and just make a big pile in the garden. Most people don't do big piles in their garden anymore. They'll put containers down, and we'll show you some of those containers later. Right, so I talked about soil fertility. I actually did a test several years ago, and this is in a school garden. So after the summer veggies, we pulled them out. We put in some broccoli seedlings. One soil didn't get any compost before we put the broccoli seedlings in, and the other one did. The difference was phenomenal. And it was enough to convince me, as if I didn't already know, how important that compost is to the soil health and consequent health of the plants. So let's look at composting first of all, then I'll look at worm farming, and then I'll look at Bokashi and talk about the differences and why you might use one over the other. So when I talk about composting, let's start with what composting isn't, because a lot of people will start off well-intentioned and it's fabulous.
How come I don't have any audio? Did I do something wrong?
Is there, everyone else got audio? Is that okay? Sorry. Okay, I'll continue. So a lot of people are well-intentioned. They'll go to, a hardware store and buy themselves a compost bin. Sometimes a lot of councils provide these. And they'll set it up in the garden somewhere and they'll just keep putting all their kitchen scraps in there. And then at some stage they'll say, I need some compost, and they'll dig around at the bottom of it, and you're ending up with a slimy, putrid smelling mess, because it's not compost, it's just rotting vegetable matter, or eggshells, whatever might be in there. It's just rotten stuff. It's not compost. And I've got to admit, my parents' composting pile was like that too. They'd go to spread it around the garden, and the stench was horrible. It really was, because they were just making a big pile of organic scraps. So that's not what composting is. What it is instead is, if we're looking at using scraps from the kitchen, they first of all, let's make sure that they are uncooked. Cooked kitchen scraps tend to attract unwanted visitors to your compost, namely rats and mice. They can smell cooked food miles away, and they'll come and get into your compost heap. We'll talk about how to avoid that later. So we want uncooked kitchen scraps. So you've chopped up the veggies, you've cracked a few eggs, you've emptied up the coffee machine. Those sorts of things are fine. If you've got a garden, some garden prunings as well. And I say clean and green. It doesn't mean you need to get the hose on them to clean them. It just means undiseased. So for example, you might be growing zucchini at the moment, and those zucchini, if at the sort of end of their life, you'll find you might get white powdery mildew all over the leaves. That's a fungal disease. I don't consider that clean. So I try to avoid putting diseased plant matter into my compost bin. When I've got these garden prunings, you notice there's secateurs there in the bucket. I like to chop them down a little bit as well, because if I put in massive amounts of unchopped stuff, they just take up too much space. There's not enough density in your compost bucket or bin to actually get anything to start to break down. So we've got kitchen scraps and we've got garden prunings, but that's not enough. We do need to add some dried stuff as well. Dried organic matter. They might be autumn leaves, and I'm going to go through a list of other things. But so far we've had green stuff from the garden, the stuff from the kitchen. We're going to consider it green because it's full of moisture, and then some dried stuff. And this is what my parents weren't doing. They weren't adding dried stuff to their compost, and so to their heap. And so when they went to move it around, it was very, very slimy and wet. So we need that dried stuff to balance out our compost. So let's look at those three elements. And then the next part of our equation is we need to add some air to that compost. We need to turn it over quite regularly. And if you're doing that, with the addition of a bit of time, then we get the finished stuff, or the stuff that's close enough to finish that once you put it onto your soil, it will break down and form that lovely stuff that I called humus before. So that's our compost equation. It's not a difficult one to master, but you've got to know what you can put in there and what you can't put in there, and how often you need to turn things over. So let's break that down. So the 4 components for success: nitrogen-based elements. So they're what I would call, say, the kitchen scraps and any green stuff from the garden. Then there's carbon-based ones, and that's your dry matter. You saw the picture of the autumn leaves. There are other things as well. So that's 2 components. The next component is oxygen. What we've got when we're breaking down all of these nitrogen and carbon-based things, we've got living organisms in there, and they need oxygen in which to survive. So we need to oxygenate our compost heap. And the last one that we need is water to feed those living things. Now, water is maybe not for a lot of people's compost bins, because if you're adding a lot of kitchen scraps and not so much of the green garden prunings, there's a lot of water already in those kitchen scraps. So you may not need to add water, but I'll suggest later when you might. So nitrogen, carbon, oxygen and water, they're our 4 components. With those, you're going to get great compost. How do we do it? Well, let's look at the items that are mainly considered to be nitrogen based. And I'll start from the kitchen scraps on the bottom left. And actually, no, I won't. I'll finish with that. Let's go to lawn clippings. Now, you probably haven't got many lawn clippings right now, except for a little bit of rain we've had over this week and a little bit last week. Your lawn probably hasn't been growing. But in springtime, if you have a lawn, you're almost out there every week to try and, to curb that growth. Can we put lawn clippings in? Well, they're almost pure nitrogen. They can. But when we're talking about that equation, the green stuff and the brown stuff, if you put too much of either the green or the brown all at once, your balance is going to be off key. So if you've got massive amounts of lawn clippings, you wouldn't be adding them to your compost bin all at once, unless you're alternating with some of the brown stuff as well. But there's other interesting things that you can put into your compost bin that are based on nitrogen. For example, your vacuum bag contents. So when you're vacuuming in the house, and particularly if you're just, look, we don't have carpets here, we've just got floorboards, I vacuum that up, I pick up a lot of dust and hair. Now, the hair is mainly protein, and protein's made up of nitrogen. But the dust, you might not know, a lot of it is just our skin. And we shed layers of skin like every 2 weeks. And they're floating around. And sometimes if the sunlight's coming through the window, you can see little dust motes. I mean, they're there all the time. So we just don't know that they're there, or don't take note that they're there. And they settle, they form dust. Your vacuum cleaner will pick that up. So if it's your skin, again, it's protein. So those vacuum contents can go into your compost bin. The green garden prunings that I mentioned before, again, if there's lots of them, you want to be able to chop them down a little bit so they break down a bit more quickly. And then there's coffee grounds. Coffee grounds are very, very high in nitrogen. And some people mistakenly will put coffee grounds directly on their soil. Not a good idea. They need to break down further, because in the breaking down process out in the open, they actually rob nitrogen from your soil. But put them into your compost bin and they'll add nitrogen. It's a bit contradictory, but don't put coffee grounds directly around your plants. It has been shown it's been proven to show that they will rob your plants of nutrients unless they're made into compost first. Now, tea bags. Tea bags are a little bit controversial there too, because not all tea bags break down completely. There is a brand, and it could be, the name escapes me, but it's quite a common brand. They will break down completely, but most won't. The little tea bag, the little paper will break down, the string will break down, you've got a staple there, that actually breaks down, adds a bit of iron to your compost or to your soil. But the bag itself might have plastics in it. And that sort of makes sense when you think you're dipping this thing into a cup of very, very hot water. Something has to be holding it together. So, do you put tea bags in or not? Look, I still do. But I prefer to drink leaf tea as much as possible. Now, garden weeds. Yes, you can put them in, but not the parts of the weeds that contain the element that's going to reproduce those weeds. So if the weeds have got seed heads, like dandelions for example, I wouldn't be putting the seed heads into your compost bucket. Or if the roots of the weeds, such as oxalis, I might understand like clover type things, those little bulbs underneath, they will probably survive through your compost, and then once you spread your compost out, they're going to be spread out as well. So yes, please add weeds, but not the parts of the weeds that will propagate themselves once more. And then let's look at the kitchen scraps. So I've got a little video here. Which kitchen scraps would I put in and which ones wouldn't? So, pardon about the quality. Fruit scraps, fantastic. Okay, particularly the soft ones. They'll break down nice and easily. And there's the tea bags. As long as they're not the tetrahedral type tea bags. Oops, sorry. No, go back again. Go back again. Excuse me. This is what I want to do. Okay, let's get just a note about the tea bags. Some of those specialty tea bags don't break down at all. But generally the other ones, you will see them broken down. This part here, capsicum's not so bad, but I wouldn't be putting in seeds of things like pumpkin or cantaloupe because they will outlive your compost and go into your garden. Onions are fine, not a problem. Avocado skins, yes, but not the stones. The stones go in my Fogo nowadays. Orange peel, there's some tea leaves in there. Orange peel, as long as you're not putting massive amounts at any one time, they can go in. Eggshells, ideally you crush them up beforehand, otherwise they're going to come out looking the same as what they were. Leafy greens, yep, all those scraps like that, they can definitely go into the compost. And there's some more, the cucumber peelings, yep, they'll break down nice and quickly. Banana peels, fantastic, high in potash or potassium, which is a fantastic element to go into your soil. That looks like coffee grounds, yep, definitely, as I mentioned before. And okay, the base of a celery or big thick broccoli stalks, those sorts of things I would chop down first. Mouldy lemons, yes, you might chop it up a little bit beforehand. These are store-bought flowers. I wouldn't put them in, but home ones I would. Bananas, did I mention that before? Definitely. And I think that's finished. Okay, just go back to those store-bought flowers. If you know anything about the flower industry, you know that they are just drenched in pesticides to keep them looking good. Okay, I wouldn't put them in. But if you've got flowers at home, yes. If you've got roses, perhaps remove the thorn on the roses before you put them in and chop them up a little bit, but they'll work. Things like, I didn't show in here, the tops of pineapples, I wouldn't put them in. They're just too dense and too fibrous to break down quickly. So this is where the Fogo comes in. The Fogo looks after all of those kitchen scraps that just take too long to break down. I mentioned before those broccoli stalks, you're going to have to, if you don't eat them, you can eat them, but if you're not going to eat them, you need to chop them down a little bit because they just, again, too dense and they just take too long to break down. Now, if you've got any questions about other kitchen scraps, pop it in the chat. We'll have a look at them afterwards. So that's the green stuff. Now, it has to be balanced by this brown stuff, and this brown stuff is carbon rich. Otherwise, remember, you're going to get that slimy, smelly mess. So starting from the top on the left, the dried leaves, and we're coming into autumn soon enough. This is where you start to gather up those autumn leaves. Hope someone is going to ask me about eucalyptus leaves, but I'll preempt it. If you've got a garden full of eucalyptus trees, I avoid putting eucalyptus leaves in there. Because they've got a sort of, well, you know how they go up in flames quite easily. It's because they're very oily on the inside. So that makes them very difficult to break down. If you do have eucalyptus leaves and you want to break them down, you'll need to run them over with a lawnmower to shred them a little bit, and then they'll break down a lot more quickly. But generally, your dried leaves from deciduous trees break down quite nicely. If you've got massive amounts of them, remember, putting anything too much all at once in there is too much for your compost. You're going to upset the balance. So I keep bags of them beside the compost bin to add as I need to. Going across to hessian, if you've got access to hessian sacks, they'll break down beautifully. Cotton knickers or old rags, as long as they're cotton, they will break down. So I used to get, particularly my girls when they were little and they'd outgrow their knickers, I used to sit there and cut away the elastic. Now I don't even bother doing that. I put them all in, and you find at the end of it you can pull out the elastic and you think, what on earth was that? And then you remember, that's right, I put some knickers in there. The cotton has broken down. And so in terms of trying to avoid waste going to landfill, your compost bin actually does a really good job of breaking down natural fibres. Now, crumpled newspaper. Does anyone still get newspapers? If you've got access to newspapers, they're very, very handy to have, to add as part of the carbon component of your compost. Twigs that you might have in the garden, pencil thickness or less. Pencil thickness or less, otherwise they're not going to break down fast enough. Pizza cartons, egg cartons, as long as it's not part of the egg carton that's got the glossy part over the top, yes, add them, but tear them up a little bit. They will break down, they'll add the carbon to your compost bin. Corrugated cardboard, as long as it's not waxed, again, that's going to work. Old straw, if you have, for example, you might have old pea straw or something from your veggie patch, that can certainly go into your compost bin. The insides of toilet rolls, yep, that works. So if you've got nothing else, you will have those at home. Collect those, add them to your compost. They'll break down quite nicely and add that carbon for you. If anyone does any wood turning or has access to wood shavings, that's almost pure carbon. So that works really well. But it's got to be wood shavings from untreated timbers. Can't be treated pine. Untreated timbers will work well. Now, animal bedding. So if you've got rabbits or guinea pigs or chickens, they will have bedding of some sort. Bedding just means it's the stuff in which they do their poo. Let's not mince words here. They do their poo and it gets absorbed by the bedding itself. Then you can add it. You might be asking yourself, well, I've got cat litter trays. Can I use that in my compost? Well, I'm going to say yes and no. No, if your compost is eventually going to make its way to the veggie patch. But if you're making compost just to spread around your ornamental plants or even around fruit trees, you can add your cat litter if it's made from, paper sort of things. But we avoid any animal manure, for example, or the bedding that comes from animals if they are meat-eating mammals, because that's too much like us as humans. And so there will be things in their manure, microorganisms that can, if you don't compost really well, they can live outside of the compost, so that once you've spread your compost, say around some lettuce, that might splash up on the lettuce leaves. Now, we're being overly cautious here, but it's pretty important that we don't put animal bedding that comes from cats and dogs in particular, so your pets at home. Also, old potting mix can go into your compost bin. Old potting mix is basically potting mix that has exhausted itself of any nutrients. Most potting mix starts off as decomposed pine bark, and then depending on how expensive the potting mix is going to be, they add other bits and pieces to keep your plants alive. But eventually that does get quite exhausted. I'm going to show you how to reuse it later, but otherwise if you wanted to, you could put it into your compost bin. So there's lots of different things that are carbon based, and it's important to have some in there. How much? We'll see. So we consider this brown stuff or dry stuff, and it's really needed, otherwise your compost isn't going to work. It's going to end up slimy and smelly. So remember that third part, we need to add also oxygen. We want to promote what we call aerobic decomposition. That is, we want the contents to decompose using oxygen. If we didn't, it becomes anaerobic, and anaerobic produces ammonia. It's quite smelly. It also produces methane gas. And methane gas is actually very, very potent greenhouse gas. So we need to add oxygen in order for this decomposition to happen. You don't need to be blowing on your compost bin. What we do instead is just using a garden fork like I'm using there, or you can buy these specialty type composting tools. This one, that's what that one's called, a tumbleweed compost mate. Looks like a big corkscrew. So if your compost heap isn't very high, that fork that I'm using works really well. But when it gets quite deep, the compost mate, that corkscrew thing, works better because you stand there and you turn it and turn it, turn it. You can get right down to the bottom of your compost. Then you lift it out, and so your compost gets both aerated as well as mixed up a little bit. Because you find that the contents in the middle of your compost bin are breaking down more quickly than the stuff on the outside. So the purpose of mixing it all up is to make sure that it's evenly decomposing. How often do I do that? Weekly. Okay, you don't need to do it every day, but weekly is ideal. So, I'll show you later in the video how I do it, but there's other ways of aerating compost, and you can buy compost rotating type tumbler bins. This is one type, and there's another one as well. And by the rotation of this barrel, that's meant to aerate or add oxygen to your compost. So that's another way of doing it. It's not my favourite, and you'll see why when I look at them. Okay, the water is the last part. We need to keep those microorganisms alive. If you find you're putting stuff in but nothing's happening, nothing's breaking down, it's probably because you haven't got enough water in there. So here is a case where you may have added a lot of garden scraps and a lot of dry matter, but there's not enough water. If you do find that nothing's happening, or if there's ants in your compost bin, that's telling you straight away it's too dry, because ants won't live where it's too wet. They won't make little tunnels. You need to get in there with a watering can and give it a good dose of water and mix things up so that everything's nice and wet. But if it's too wet, you'll get smelly compost. If it's too dry, no decomposition will happen. And just right means that if you were to get a handful of the compost, stuff that's breaking down, and squeeze it, you'll get, it's like the consistency of a wet sponge. Not too wet though, okay? So a wrung out sponge. You might get 1 or 2 drops of water in a handful of compost coming out, and that's just right. My nose and my eyes tell me about my compost bin. So there is certainly a science about it. I can give you ratios of how carbon to nitrogen ratios, but I don't bother. No one's weighing their compost stuff. What I look at as I'm turning it, if it's smelly, that tells me straight away I've got too much green stuff, too much water. I need to add more brown stuff to balance that off. But if nothing's happening as I'm turning it, it's too dry. So using your nose and your eyes, so I call it a little bit of art of composting rather than the science of it. So other things you can add to your compost to just boost it along a little bit. You might, for example, grow some stuff in your garden. And this one here is called comfrey. And the leaves are a powerhouse of fantastic nutrients. The roots of comfrey go quite deep, and so they are able to take the nutrients, in my case in a clay soil, and concentrate them into the leaves. And so if you get a handful of leaves of comfrey, tear them up a little bit, put them into your compost, it sort of gives it a bit of a jump start. You do need to tear them up. And also I would be wearing gloves, because they're very, very fine hairs, which can be an irritant. There's another one which is less irritating. And once you've got comfrey in the garden, you've got it forever. So just be careful when you grow it. You do need to put some sort of root barrier or grow it in a pot. Or there's this other one called borage. And borage right now, you'll find plenty of it if you're growing it. This one self-seeds. The bees love it. In fact, the bees love the comfrey flowers as well. But again, borage is one that's got its leaves are full of nutrients. So add a handful of those every now and again. But if you couldn't be bothered growing anything, you can just get yourself some organic fertilizer, such as the chicken manure based fertilizers, Rooster Booster, Organic Extra, Dynamic Lifter, or even just Blood and Bone. Those sorts of things are very high in nitrogen. What happens is if you add extra nitrogen to your compost, the bacteria, they're the ones that feed on the nitrogen, they start to rapidly multiply, and that heats up your compost bin. And then as it cools down, then that's where the fungi come in and break down the more woody stuff. So if you want to really heat things up, that's when you might add some fertilizer to it. You could also add farm animal manures. Remember, not your dog and cat manure unless you're not going to use your compost in your veggie patch. But farm animals could be sheep manure, cow manure, horse manure. Be careful because that'll have a lot of seeds in it, but composted, hopefully those seeds will break down. So again, food from non-meat eating, not from poos that come from not mammals that are meat eating. Well, that was a bit convoluted. So basically not dogs and cats, but other animals are fine. Chook manure is fantastic. Chooks will eat meat, but they're not mammals. So the pathogens in their poo aren't ones that we're going to pick up as such. Liquid seaweed also helps, and that particularly if you find you've got a dry compost, put a bit of liquid seaweed in there and in your watering can and water it in. Coffee grounds, remember I said they're high in nitrogen. If you're a regular local coffee shop, ask them to give you a bag of coffee grounds at the end of the day. They're usually happy to get rid of them, and they're fantastic additive to your compost to start things heating up a little bit. And this last one's interesting, molasses. Soil bacteria love molasses. So a tablespoon or two in a watering can of water, give it a good slosh around, and then put it into your compost heap. And that will start to feed up that bacteria. So if you want to see some action in your compost, getting it nice and hot, think of these sorts of additives. So if you haven't started composting, how do you start? So I've put together a little video. It doesn't have any sound, I don't think, so I'm going to talk over it. Starting a compost heap. I'm calling it cold composting because you're not going to get the heat up in your compost bin if you're just adding things occasionally. So always start on soil. And at the base of the soil, I'll put some twigs down there because I need drainage to happen. So there's a fair amount of twiggy stuff going at the base. I want any liquid that forms not to stay there, otherwise we're going to get a slimy mess. So there's a base of twiggy stuff. And then I'll start adding my kitchen scraps, all the ones that I mentioned before that are fine to use. It's a layer of kitchen scraps. Then I need to add some brown matter. And here I've got autumn leaves or some newspaper. That looks like old pea straw that I've got in there. So I'll add a decent layer of that because its volume, it's much more voluminous than the kitchen scraps. So you actually need to add quite a lot of it because there's a lot of air in there as well. Then I put the lid on. 1 week later, I might have gathered up all my kitchen scraps and been adding them throughout the week. But at the end of that week, add some more scraps, add some more, and here I'm adding newspaper. Notice I'm scrunching it up because that adds air at the same time rather than just shredding it. So add some newspaper, fair bit of it, if you can get it. And then I start to turn it. So after a week, I've been adding my kitchen scraps. At the end of the week, I'm adding my newspaper as well, or the other brown stuff, and then I need to start turning it around. It's not back-breaking stuff. It's all that incidental exercise that we're encouraged to have nowadays. Put the lid back on, and then again start the process. Collect your stuff all over the week. Now you'll find that this method is called cold composting because the volume of stuff that you're putting in is not going to generate terribly much heat at any one time. If you're adding some of the jumpstart stuff I mentioned before, the fertilizer and so on, you will get a little bit of heat, but it's not going to be sustained heat. So it's known as cold composting. You'll never fill a bin cold composting because the stuff at the bottom is decomposing while you are still filling. So if you're a keen gardener, you want to get some compost out into your garden, you're saying to yourself, well, when am I going to get this finished compost? What you need to do is decide when to stop filling that bin to let it finish breaking down. And there's 2 times of the year that I add compost to my soil. And I'm coming up soon to one of them. As soon as my summer veggies are out and I can get my autumn winter veggies in, I need to add compost to that soil. So a few months ago I stopped adding to that bin so that it might take up to 6 months to completely break down. I know it's going to be ready come March or April when I want to put compost in my soil. So what do you do in the meantime? Well, in the meantime you should be also turning it over every now and again to make sure it's evenly decomposing. But what do you do in the meantime with the rest of your scraps? You don't want to be throwing them away or just putting them in your FOGO bin. The way you keep composting, you're going to need more than one bin. So here is a picture of 3 of my bins here. You notice there's a brick on the middle one. That's telling everyone in the family when you go to put scraps in, don't put it in that one. That's the one that's being allowed to mature. The one on the left, I can't remember what was in that one, and the one on the right might be the one that we're currently filling. So you might not need 3, but you need at least 2. One has compost left to mature, and you begin the process again with another bin. Up until recently I was working in a school kitchen in fact, and I had to put signs on top of the compost bins, please don't touch me, I'm maturing, or I'm still rotting down, whatever it might be, so that people knew where to put their compost scraps. You might not need 3, you will need 2. Just notice though on the right hand side, those 3 bins, there's a just ordinary household bin right at the back there. That was holding all my brown matter, the dry stuff to add. And it was in a boys' school and they had woodworking facilities. So I used to be able to get lots of pine shavings, untreated pine shavings. And that's what was being added to our compost or our kitchen scraps basically. There was no garden scraps that went in. This was just kitchen scraps plus the wood shavings, and it still made beautiful compost. So at least 2 bins. So have a think in your head. Have you got space in your garden to be putting 2 of those out? So that's basically how to make compost. But let's look at which problems I've noticed people have. First of all, if it's too smelly, it means you know what that means now. It's too wet, or you haven't been aerating it. So get out there and move it around a little bit with your garden fork and add some of the dry stuff. Adding too much of anything at once, and this is particularly the case for lawn clippings or lots of green garden prunings. You had a lovely Sunday afternoon in the garden, you're putting everything in the compost bin. You can't put too much at once, unless perhaps you've got one of those big compost bays that they used to have when people's gardens were much bigger, at least 1 cubic meter that they were adding stuff to. So you might need to stockpile next to your compost bin so you can add either the green or the brown stuff as you need it. Think of your compost as a layer cake, or sometimes people call it a lasagna. You need different levels of things. You can't have too much of anything. If nothing is happening, well, now that's because it's probably too dry. So water it well with some sort of seaweed or some organic fertilizer to get it going. Now, vinegar flies. We're not talking fruit fly here. That's completely different. Vinegar flies will come in quite naturally, and sometimes you might have fruit in your fruit bowl at home. You see all these little flies going around. The eggs might have been in the skin, and so they hatch out. They love acidic conditions. And your compost is naturally acidic, particularly if adding a lot of fruit scraps in there. They are all part of the mechanism by which ingredients break down. So don't worry too much about them, but they can be annoying. If they do annoy you, what you'll need to do is either get a big wad of newspaper or a Hessian sack, put that inside your compost bin on top of the compost contents. Vinegar flies don't go deep, they just want to feed on what's on the surface. So if you smother them, and every time you want to put some kitchen scraps in there, you take that Hessian sack off, that will minimise, the infestation that you get every time you open up that lid. This is the big issue: rats and mice. They will come in by digging underneath. So unless you've got a compost bin that sits quite off the ground completely, they'll burrow in underneath. If they're not going in there for the food, and that's why I said keep your cooked kitchen scraps out of there, they might be going in there in colder months because it's warm under there. But there's nothing more disconcerting when you open up the lid and a rat or something jumps out. And it's happened once or twice to me. You might have heard me scream. So what I do now is at the base of the compost bin, rather than putting it directly on the soil, I go to that large department store, you all know which one I'm talking about, the hardware store, and you can buy Avery mesh. Not chicken wire, because the holes are too big, but Avery mesh, where the squares are less than 10 mil or 1 centimetre square, much smaller. We place that directly on the ground and then put your compost bin on top. And make sure it extends a little bit further than the edges of the compost bin. So they might burrow underneath, but they can't get into your compost bin. So that's the only way I know how to do it. Otherwise, you've got to get yourself a bin that sits right up off the ground. And it's got to be made of quite heavy plastic, because otherwise they can chew through plastic too. But overall, remember I said composting is more an art than a science. There is science behind it, but you, in order to make good compost, learn to compost by feel or by smell or by vision rather than by the science. What to do with your finished compost, and I may have mentioned before, it might take 6 months from where to go, from when you start a compost to when you decide to stop and let it mature. It's going to take quite a while. I use it specifically to rejuvenate my soil. So in between plantings, out comes the compost. I've got to make up for the fact that I've taken a lot of soil away in the form of fruit and vegetables. I need to replenish that soil. And there's nothing better than compost. You can go out and buy compost, or you can go out and buy cow manure or something. But if you can make it at home for no cost at all, why wouldn't you do it? Now, potting mix is also very expensive to buy. So I would go like 50% potting mix, 50% compost. You can't use compost as a straight potting mix because you need air pockets in order for soil roots to be able to go through, and compost will just compact too deep, too bad. But you can certainly get some cheap potting mix and bulk it up and make it much better by adding compost to it. You could make a compost extract, and here I've got compost in a fine mesh bag, and I've made like a big giant tea bag out of it. And so you can get some of that stuff and pour it around your plants. Pour it over the leaves of the plants as well, because they can take in the nutrients via the leaves too. But consider your compost a soil conditioner. People might call it a fertilizer. You can't call it a fertilizer. It really depends on what goes in there. The fertilizer has to be in high nitrogen, phosphorus and potash, and really depends on what you've put in. But it certainly conditions your soil, adding humus back into your soil so the plant's roots can take up all the nutrients that are around, and so they grow really strongly as well. Let's look at composting containers, then I'll stop and take questions if there are any, because I'm just going to look at 2 tonight. These bottomless bins, the ones that sit directly on the soil or on top of that wire mesh to stop rats and mice getting in, they are the cheapest. And by cheap I mean this one here I found on someone's hard waste collection. And I don't have a big car, but I managed to stuff it in the back seat to take it home. So I wouldn't buy one outright unless you go to marketplace or something like that. A lot of people will buy compost bins and then want to try, and then they end up with that slimy mess. They don't want to do it anymore, so they're trying to get rid of them. So I would never buy one new. Always look on marketplace or eBay or something like that. What I also like about them though, for me it's easy to turn over the contents. I just take off the lid and move things around using my garden fork or that compost aerator tool. Then once your compost is finished, you lift the whole thing off as if you're making a big sandcastle, lift it off, and you shovel your compost into your wheelbarrow and off you go. They're the advantages. The disadvantages, though, it's not a one bin system. You need at least 2 bins. You also need to protect against rodents, as we mentioned. Also, any beautiful liquid that forms in there has to drain away, otherwise you're going to get a slimy compost. So you're losing that beautiful leach. It's called leachate, compost leachate. You're losing it, which means that the soil beneath this compost bin is going to be really quite fertile. So you might consider, once you've taken it off, to move it to somewhere else and perhaps plant in that soil there. And we can't really collect compost unless the whole lot has been finished. Now there are variations to this theme where they might have a little hatch at the base that you can get your finished compost while the stuff at the top still breaking down. So you can look out for things like that. But the ones that I've got, I need to wait until all the compost is mature. I lift the whole thing off and then I use what I need. So that's those type. They're by far my favourite. And then there's the rotating or tumbling bins. The advantages of those is that by the tumbling or the rotating, they aerate the contents. And also, being above the ground, they're rodent proof. But if you've ever had one of these, you realise that the more stuff you put in them, they get very, very heavy. Now the one on the right is one that I took just as a demonstration. I just want to see how well they worked. And I found that trying to rotate it was really, really difficult when it got close to even just half full. And the one on the left, you had to get in from underneath and tip the whole thing around. Now, particularly one on the left, you might be able to picture if it's all at the bottom and you pick it up, or manage to tumble it so that everything in there falls to the bottom. It's not getting terribly mixed up. We're just going from one end to the other without mixing it terribly much. So they are the different disadvantages. They are heavy to turn, and I found the one on the right, the contents would clump, so they weren't breaking down. There wasn't air getting into those clumps. So when I went to empty it, which was also very difficult to empty, I'd get clumps that hadn't broken down and they were very smelly. You also need a second bin. You need to be able to stop at some point in order to allow the stuff to break down. So you're going to need a second bin. And have a look. The one on the right is advertised as being perfect for your patio, but it leaks. It forms liquid in there. Remember that leachate I was talking about? It's got to go somewhere, and it comes out through all of the different panels. So it didn't look quite as nice and new as it did when it was clean as when it was new. So I wouldn't recommend one of these if you're ever going to buy a compost bin. I'd certainly just go for the plain, easy ones, as long as you rodent proof them. I'm going to stop here, Cara. Are there any questions at this point before we look at the other forms of recycling?
Yes, thank you. There's a few questions in the chats. Just lost it. Is it okay to put crushed eggshells, used tea powder, beetroot skin, used cloves, cinnamon sticks at the bottom of plants?
Oh, straight on the plants. Look, before compost bins were invented, people used to do what's called trench composting, where they would dig a trench in their veggie patch or in their garden, and they'd put all those bits and pieces you mentioned at the base of the soil, and then put more soil on top. Then once, after a little while, then you could plant over it. I wouldn't be doing that directly under your plants. I'd compost them first, and those things are all fine to go into your compost bin.
Thank you. And can we put tea bags in compost?
I do. I do. Okay. Now, if you're using tea bags that have, if there might be plastics inside the bag, or, forming the bag, what you're going to have is, what in essence, microplastics throughout your garden. Okay. So, if you're really worried about that, look up the tea bags. I think they're the Twinings ones, the ones that are fully compostable, but don't quote me on that. But look up which ones are fully compostable and go to those, or just drink leaf tea, which is another option.
Thank you. And what about moldy food scraps such as top tomatoes?
Yeah, mouldy's fine. Mouldy's just the decomposition process starting to happen, not a problem. Some people also ask about rhubarb leaves because they're toxic to us humans. Not a problem composting them, they'll break down into their individual components. So mould is just the decomposition starting to happen.
Yep,
That's fine.
again, thank you. Rowena asks, I put coffee grounds on my lawn. Should I dig them in or try to remove to compost?
If you've got copious amounts, don't dig. Don't just leave them. They'll break down, but don't. I wouldn't be doing it again. Okay, it'd be interesting to see if your lawn's sort of yellowing off around that area. It was a colleague of mine that did this as her thesis topic. She did trials with plants being grown with coffee grounds around them and so on, and there was quite a detrimental effect. So compost is fine. So I would probably try and water them in a little bit, or you might over sow with, or not over sow, but put in some blood and bone just to counteract the fact that you're taking nitrogen away. If you find that there's yellowing, otherwise put your coffee grounds straight into your compost bin instead.
Thank you. Someone else has asked, I believe that rotatable compost drums should be good.
Look, in theory they're good. In practice, I found them really difficult to make good compost. I've got to be honest. I really found it difficult, and so I got rid of mine. I didn't bother with it. But the theory is, yes, they should be, as by rotating, they're adding oxygen. But when they're heavy, they're very difficult to rotate or tumble. So theory is good, but in practice, I just find the standalone ones, standing on the soil, work much, much better. Much better.
Thank you. And can we put coloured glossy magazine pages for carbon?
No. Leave the glossy stuff out because I don't know what's making it glossy. Newspapers are fine, even the coloured print, because they're all vegetable-based prints. But I don't know there's plasticizers or something in that paper. I don't know what it is. I wouldn't be putting the glossy stuff in.
Okay. What about other natural fibres like bamboo or wool?
Yeah, definitely. And I did cut up an old jumper because I make rugs and things out of old jumpers, and I had some offcuts, so I put them in the compost bin. I haven't seen them since, so they've broken down. Yeah, anything that was once living will break down again. Okay, some things just take a lot longer, but yeah, bamboo fibres and so on, definitely. Wool, yep.
Great, thank you. Isn't a dog a meat-eating mammal, so therefore cannot use?
Yes. So don't put dog poo in your compost bin.
Okay.
Yep.
Is dog hair okay from the vacuum bag?
Yep, dog hair's fine. Dog hair is fine.
And is it okay to put chicken poo in the compost?
Chicken poo is like gold for your compost bin. Okay, it's gold. I've got chooks, and they in the chicken coop. They're on pine pine shavings, untreated, and so when I clean out the chicken coop, I keep bags of that stuff next to my compost bin, and I add that. So that's chicken poo is high in nitrogen. The pine shavings are pure carbon, basically, and that just honestly, it's fantastic. So if you've got chook poo, yes, definitely.
Gina has said that she has the compost aerator but never uses it because she doesn't want to. Sorry, I'm losing my. Because she doesn't want to disturb the worms? Do they mind or?
Yeah, no, they won't mind. They're fine. None of them complain to me. It's probably less. It's probably better than the fork that's got 4 prongs. That's only got 1 prong. No, you might be sacrificing a worm or two. Now, just a note about those worms. You don't need worms in your compost bin in order to make good compost. Worms come in to break down the stuff or to finish off the stuff that's already broken down. And when we talk about worm farming, you'll see why. But people, when I was working in a nursery, which I did for close to 2 decades, a lot of people would come in and buy boxes of worms, and I'd have a chat to them. I said, "Oh, you're starting up a worm farm?" No, I need to add them to my compost bin. I said, "Don't waste your money. If there aren't worms in there already, these worms that you're putting in there aren't going to be happy in there. All right, worms will come into your compost bin at the end, but if you're adding worms straight into a compost bin, it's just full of food scraps. They won't hang around for too long. It's a very fine balance. So don't worry about turning the worms. That they'll survive. They'll survive.
Sure. This next one just says smelly compost and ants at top ? I'm assuming that they're asking if that's okay or.
Okay. All right. So ants at the top means what you've got at the top is either ants love it or it's very dry at the top. I would suggest you get in there. If it's smelly, you need to mix it up. You need to aerate it. That helps with the smell, and then add some of your dry stuff. Whether it be your crumpled up newspaper, your egg carton, whatever it might be. A fair bit of it. Mix it through. That'll absorb some of the moisture. That'll get rid of the smell as well.
Sure. Thank you. How long for maturing?
All right. If you say put the lid on the compost bin and say I'm not going to add any more to this, you can assume 4 to 5 months before it's ready to go out into the garden. But you do need to go every now and again and turn it over just to make it sure it's evenly decomposing. Sure. You can go faster. But and I'd invite you to go and look at my website. There's a video on how to make fast compost, but it's a little bit more complicated if you want really fast compost. Yeah.
Thank you. And what about the in-ground ones?
In-ground ones are more for worm farming, and you'll see what this is. Oh, actually, okay, you're talking about the solar digesters. Is that what they're talking about? I might mention it again at the end. Okay. I'm not a fan of them if you're in an area with clay soils. Sandy soils are fine, not clay soils. But I can have a chat later at the end about that one.
Sure.
Let me get on to worm farming, which won't take us long.
Okay, there's a couple more, sorry.
Sure. Okay, no, go for it.
The questions just keep popping up. How can I avoid snails in compost?
You got a lid on there? That's interesting. I don't tend to get snails. Now and again a slug might get in there. I don't tend to get snails. How can you avoid them? Okay, all right. So snails and spiders and things like that. Snails are breaking down your stuff. So if you're not too squeamish, you can leave them there. But the more you go in and rotate your compost and move things around, the less likely you're going to have creepy crawlies in there that you don't want. They don't like being disturbed. So snails are hiding in their back caps because you've been ignoring your compost, possibly. I don't tend to get snails in mine, maybe because I am quite an active composter. Yeah.
Sure. There's a couple of people asking, I have a standing compost bin, and sometimes when I take off the lid, there are a lot of worms at the top of the bin. Could it be too wet?
Okay, worms are fantastic creatures. They're responding to prevailing weather conditions, particularly the air pressure. So they can almost anticipate when it's going to rain. So you can imagine if they were in the soil and they're anticipating a low pressure system, it's going to rain a lot. They've got to come to the surface, otherwise they'll drown if there's a lot of water. So if they're coming to the surface, it could be because of rain. But it also could be because your compost is too hot. Too hot's fine, except worms don't like it. They'll go in once it's cooled down again. So it could be either rain is coming or it's you've got a really hot compost happening, and they'll go back in once it cools down.
Okay, thank you. Another one. I have kitchen scraps that have turned to sludge. Can I still use that material if I turn the contents and add dry matter, etc.?
Absolutely, yeah, of course you can. Just add lots of the dry matter, sure.
And are paper towels and tissues okay to add?
Okay, paper towel, as long as you haven't used it to wipe out, a smelly fry pan. Okay, but if it's just been a wetted paper towel, that's fine. Tissues, I tend not to use them. I tend not to put them in if you've been blowing your nose and there's lots of stuff on there. I tend not to put tissues in there. I know in Manningham we can put tissues in our Fogo. I don't know about Brimbank, so I'm not too sure. The difference between your home composting and stuff that goes out for food organics, garden organics composting, they operate a much hotter composting system, much hotter. And so that breaks down all of those pathogens that might be there in your tissues and so on. Whereas we don't tend to do that in home composting. That's why I avoid tissues going in there.
Sure, thank you. And last one, what about cow manure?
Cow manure is beautiful. Cow manure is great. Not a problem. Okay, so that's your farm animal manure. So put some of that in just to sort of heat up and get your compost working a little bit faster.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. Yeah, I think we're ready to move on to worm farming.
No worries. Okay. So why do I keep worm farms as well as compost buckets? The byproducts. So we'll get some fantastic byproducts, which before when I said compost is a soil conditioner to rejuvenate soil, your worm farm byproducts I treat as a fertilizer, which means I don't need to buy fertilizer for my garden. If you're just going to operate a worm farm, it's only suitable for small scale households because worms can't eat all that much very, very quickly. But if there's only one or two of you in the household, perhaps your kitchen scraps are good enough for them there. And we don't tend to put garden waste in there. Maybe a few autumn leaves, but not massive amounts. The worms that we put in our worm farms are designed to eat broken down matter, and your garden scraps just don't break down as quick, say, as your kitchen scraps. So, the products that we get from them. First of all, let's call it worm wee. It's not Indian tonic water. I really should relabel that bottle. It's a dark brown substance, and it's not their literally not their wee, but it's the leachate. It's the stuff that drips through the worm farm itself because moisture that comes through. And we treat it as a fertilizer, which you do need to dilute it. It's not going to burn your plants if you use it straight because it is really quite pH neutral and everything, but it's wasteful. So when we dilute it, we look at a ratio of putting some in a bucket of water so that the water looks like the colour of a cup of tea. So it's hard to say 1 to 10, 1 to 20 because it really depends on how brown or how dark your leachate or worm wheat is. Then there's also the vermicast, which eventually after you've started your worm farm is the worm poo itself, and this is quite literally the fertilizer. Separating the worm poo from the worms itself is a little bit of an art. It can be done though, and you can use, if I've ever got any that I bothered to do this, I'll get some, and when I'm planting I'll put some in the planting hole, or I'll put a trowel load, which is what my daughter is separating there. I'll put that amount after I've taken the worms out. I'll put them in a watering can and take the head off the watering can, the rose part of it, and put water in there and give it a good stir around, and then pour that around your soil. So that's a lot more even than trying to put little bits and pieces of vermicast. I found this vermicast watered in to dry soils helps to re-wet them. So up until this rain that we had yesterday, it's been pretty dry, well, up until say a fortnight ago, and soils can get so dry that they don't take moisture in anymore. They become what's called hydrophobic. Vermicast helps to reverse that hydrophobic nature of the soil, and so the water penetrates rather than running off the top of your garden beds. So this is why I do have worm farms, for the fact that I've got these fertilizers and the vermicast in case I need to re-wet the soil. Now, worm farming, there's lots of different worm farms, but they all have something in common. They will all have a layer at the base that collects the liquid. The worms don't live in that layer. They live in the layers above, and there's an outlet where you've got a tap, and you can tap off that liquid and then dilute it and use it in your garden. Now, when I've got these ones operating, I like to leave that outlet, that tap, open, and I'll put a bucket underneath, because I don't want too much liquid accumulating in there, because sometimes the worms fall from the layer that they're living in. They fall through and they can drown if there's too much liquid sitting there. So the next layer above the liquid layer is where the worms live. So we start off, when you get a worm farm, or when you buy the worms for the worm farm, they come with what's called bedding, which is just, it could be some sort of manure that they live in, and they start to chew through and start to eat before you start to feed them. And eventually that all becomes vermicast, or that worm poo, which is your fertilizer. So that's the layer above. Once we've filled that layer, then there's a spare tray which sits on top, and the theory is that they move from where they have finished feeding, where it's nice and full, and you start to feed into the next layer, so that first layer that was full, you can now take that vermicast out, and there shouldn't be any worms in there. That's the theory. Not all, I don't think all the worms got the memo that they're meant to move up to the top. So even if you started feeding up the top, there will still be some left in the middle that you'll need to extricate before you start to move the vermicast around. So all of them have this sort of basic design: the base with the liquid layer, the outlet for the tap, and then separate ones that they move into. They also either come with a worm blanket, or you can make your own worm blanket. You don't need to get out the crochet hook or the knitting needles. It's not literally a blanket, but this is just making the most of the fact that worms, these types of worms, which tend to be the varieties that are reds and tiger worms, they come from warm, temperate rainforest areas. So you can imagine lots of leaf litter on the ground, and underneath it starts to rot, and those worms are feeding from underneath. They don't feed from the top because there's birds around and they're going to come and eat them. So they're used to feeding under a layer. So when we feed our worms, we don't just dump food on top, we put it underneath a layer, and that layer is what we call a worm blanket. It could just be a layer of newspaper, or if you had a pizza, it could be the pizza carton. Eventually they can eat through that layer too, if it's something that's made out of something organic. But you'll need a worm blanket. Now, which worms? They're sold as composting worms. You can see there the ones that we call tigers. You can see the stripes on them quite distinctly. And they'll come in a starter pack, which is usually 1,000 worms. They haven't been counted, they get weighed instead, and they're sitting in some sort of bedding. You can't use your garden worms. They will operate in a worm farm, but they're just not designed to feed on matter very quickly, unlike the ones that live in the warm, temperate rainforest areas. So they're just too slow. You're not going to get as fast vermicast and fertilizer coming from them. We find that you'll find if you start up a worm farm, they eat a lot more in in summertime, or when the weather is warm. Their ideal temperatures are anything between 21 and 25 degrees Celsius. So you can imagine, again, being up in Queensland, you're underneath that layer of that rotting matter. It's about that 21 to 25 degrees Celsius under there. And that's when they're most active. So you find that over winter, you might be feeding your worms, but they're just not feeding as much. They're just not used to the cold temperatures. They're just laying low until it warms up all over again. But not your garden soil worms. They're just not going to be as productive. Now, when we go to feed them, and I've got here as an example, I've cut cantaloupe. They love fruit scraps, so we'll eat the cantaloupe. They love the skin. They'll chew through that quite. Well, did I say chew? Worms don't have teeth. Worms will start to feed on things that are breaking down, and we find that scraps from fruit, but not orange peel or citrus peel, they break down quite quickly, so worms will go through them quickly. But the seeds of the cantaloupe, I wouldn't use at all. Don't put them in there. They'll eat around the seeds, but they can't eat seedy things at all. So if you ever put that in there, they'll eat around them, and then those seeds will start to sprout in your worm farm. You'll need to remove them. So don't put seedy scraps into your worm farm. Vegetable peels, yes, they'll go through those, but the vegetable peels seem to be a lot more fibrous. They don't break down as quickly. I used to think my worms were fussy. They'd eat the cantaloupe, they wouldn't eat the potato peel. It's just that the potato peel has to start to break down before they start to eat it. They don't have teeth. If you've got pizza boxes, newspaper, you can wet that down. Either use it as a worm blanket, or you can feed it to them. They'll eat it. To prevent the contents becoming too acidic, particularly if you're using a lot of fruit scraps, they are much more acidic. You do need to balance that out with something a little bit alkaline. So a sprinkle of garden lime, or some finely crushed eggshells, or if you've got a wood fire, some of the wood ash sprinkled in there every now and again, just to balance the pH again, and so it doesn't become too acidic in there. You can tell it becomes acidic if there's those vinegar flies floating around every time you take the lid off. If they're there, it's telling you the contents are too acidic. So this is one where we need to be careful. We don't put in the citrus. We don't put in the onions, because the onions are very acidic. The meat scraps and dairy products, sure, they'll eat them, but guess what else will eat them too? And this is where your rats and mice, if they can make it in. But what I've found is once we put in perhaps they were just noodles from a stir fry, inadvertently got put into the worm bucket, and lifted off the lid, and there was a whole heap of maggots in the worm farm. And I managed to get them out easily enough. And if ever that happens to you, all you need to do is get a piece of white bread, soak it in milk, sit it on top of your worm farm contents, and the maggots will be attracted to that, and then lift the whole lot off. And I fed it to my chooks, actually. They really enjoyed that. So just avoid things that are going to attract blowflies, for example, and that's your cooked scraps and your dairy. If you want to do some very easy worm farming, where you don't need to look after them too much, you can purchase these, this one's called a worm feast, where you can see the soil level there, and there's a cap at soil level, and then your worms sit in the soil. So you've dug out a hole, you put your worm feast container in there, and you put your worms in there, and you feed directly into that. Those worms can come and go into your garden soil, but they'll always come back because of the food that you've got in there. You can buy one, or you can make one yourself. So here I've got a largish garden pot, drilled holes in it, dug a hole in my garden bed, and this is now looking down into it. So the rim of that is at soil level. Watermelon skin, they love that. I put a handful of worms from my worm farm in there, and I would feed them from that. I did find I had to put a lid over it though, because the magpies managed to work out that, you know, just lift off the newspaper and there's a feast under there. So I had to put a lid, which is just an upturned garden pot base. So here is one where you don't need to worry about them so much. They can go in and out of the soil and then come back. And as they're going out to the soil, they're feeding your garden too at the same time by doing their poo around your plants. Now, any questions about worm farming? That was very quick, I realised, but when you do buy a worm farm, they'll come with lots of instructions. One thing I do need to note though, I haven't mentioned it here, on hot days those worms have to be protected. They will cook. So on those days we're getting anything above 30 degrees, you've got to be very careful. Your worm farm can't be out in the sunshine. It's got to be in complete shade. In winter it doesn't really matter, but in summer your worm farm has to be kept in shade. So it could even be in the garage. It doesn't have to be in the garden as such. Any
Thank you.
questions, Kiara, about worms?
Yes, just a few. How do you extract the worms from level 2 to level 3?
Okay, you stop feeding in level 2, but level 3 has to be sitting directly on top of level 2. There can't be like an air gap. They're not going to go through the air to go to the next one. So the level 2 has to be completely full, then you sit level 3 on top of it and you feed into level 3 and then they start to move up. It'll take a while though, they won't do it straight away.
Okay, thank you. What else apart from a worm blanket, pizza box, or newspaper can you use?
Old t-shirts, cotton t-shirts, I'm using those at the moment. They're too old to take to an op shop. I've got plenty of rags, so I'll use old cotton t-shirts, for example. Hessian, if you've got access to Hessian at all. Any natural fibres, really. And if the worms, if you forget to feed the worms for a couple of weeks, they'll eat through that too. Worms are actually really clever. They'll reproduce if there's plenty of food, but if you forget to feed them, as long as it's not for too long, they'll just stop reproducing. They'll just sort of chew through whatever they're living in, which is basically their vermicast. Yeah.
Thank you. And can you use a worm feast in ground be used in a wicking bed?
Yes. Yeah, it'd be fine in a wicking bed. Yeah, as long as you're not perforating the wicking bed layer at the bottom. Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you. And do you need a blanket in a worm fest?
Not if you're going to put a cover on it like I did. Okay? Not if you're going to do that, because that basically is your cover. If you wanted to, you could cut out, a round of cardboard or something, or an old t-shirt would work, but I found I didn't really need to in this case.
And can you have too many worms in a worm farm?
Yeah, possibly. I don't think I've ever had that happen. If it does, you sort of take out a shovel load and give them away to someone else. They tend to limit their reproduction according to prevailing conditions. So like I said before, if there's not enough food, they just won't reproduce enough as much. But yeah, if you've got too many, sure, give them away to someone else. Don't put them in your soil unless you've got one of these worm feast things, okay? Don't put them straight into the soil. There's not enough food in the soil for them.
Thank you. I see little white insects around the food scraps in the worm farm. They are not worms. Are they good in worm farm?
There's little springtail, they're fine. They're fine. Oh, I've got them as well. Tiny little crawling insects. Yeah, they're fine. They don't bother the worms. Yeah, it's not a problem. Springtails, I think they're called.
Thank you. Why do I have no success with my worm farm? There's very low numbers and no wee.
And no worm wheat. Okay, you can manufacture some worm wheat, and this is a good idea every now and again to make sure your bedding stays moist as well. I'd get my watering can, maybe half fill it, making sure the tap at the base is open, and I'll lift off the lid of my worm farm and I'll give them a shower. Pour this water over them, and you can hear it dripping through. And so you can manufacture worm wee. If you haven't got enough in there, you can make your own that way, just by giving them a shower every now and again. It'll come out diluted, which means you don't need to dilute it before you put it out into your garden. It probably means that you're feeding a lot of things that aren't high in moisture. Fruit scraps have got more moisture, say, than vegetable scraps. So maybe move to a little bit more fruit at this time of the year.
Okay, thank you. My worm farm volume is sinking steadily despite lots of worms eating lots. Why is that?
Why is it? Oh, I don't know actually. Why is it sinking? I suppose the contents, because when you take out the vermicast, it is really quite dense and quite mucky. Okay, so perhaps what you're feeding or what they're feeding, they're just reducing that volume right down. That's the only explanation I can think for that.
Sure, thank you. I collect worm wee in milk cartons. How long do they store, or how quickly can I?
Yeah, look, you do want to use it quite quickly. It's what's in there is a whole lot of good bacteria, microorganisms. They're not going to last forever in there. So even if it's old, you'll get some value out of it, but it's much better if it's fresh.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other tips for cooked worms? Most of mine died when we had a hot spell. They were shaded, and I watered them and had put extra wet cardboard on top.
Okay.
This seems to be for your lives patch, but not
All right. So anticipating hot weather, I will get a takeaway food container or something and fill it up with water and freeze it. So the morning of the hot weather, I'll take it out of the container. So I've got a large block of ice. I'll sit it on top of the worm blanket, and gradually that will melt throughout the day and just keep the contents cool. Or perhaps, particularly if it's one of those black ones, maybe get a wet blanket or again wet hessian and just drape it over the top, because as that water evaporates from that keeps that'll keep the contents a bit cooler. Yeah, cooked worms aren't good. You open up the lid and you can smell that you've killed your worms, unfortunately. It does happen, but yeah. A melted ice block helps. Yeah.
In my veggie garden, what can I do to see worms in my soil?
Add compost. Or, can I get onto Bokashi, because that'll bring worms to your soil too. I'm just noticing about 5 to 8 here.
Yeah, one question actually.
Sure.
How long does worm tea keep?
Just like I said before, use it as fresh as possible. All right. Okay. Even if it's old, it'll have benefit, but it's got a lot more benefit the fresh. Say up to 2 weeks.
All right. Thank you. All right.
Okay. Let's get on to Bokashi. This one won't take long at all, but you might not be familiar. Bokashi buckets are exactly that. It's a bucket which has at the base of it a tap, again, because a liquid is going to be formed, which is quite a strong fertilizer. The advantage of the Bokashi bucket, it takes all kitchen scraps. Whereas we couldn't use this or that in compost and worm farming, this will take all kitchen scrap. Your cooked ones, your cheese, all those sorts of things. That can all go in there. And it's just got a very, very slight smell to it. It's not certainly terribly pongy or anything. The disadvantages, though, is that in order to get your food scraps to break down, we need this additive, and it's called Bokashi mix. It's either a mix, like a grain type mix, or it can be added like a spray. Something is needed because the process that breaks down the scraps in here is a fermentation process. And if you understand anything about fermentation, you know you need some sort of starter. And on this grain, this Bokashi mix, or in the spray, that has the organisms in there that act as the starter to start to break down this thing. It only takes kitchen waste, so here you can't use your paper towel, you can't use your serviettes and so on. It has to be just straight, and no garden waste either. It's just kitchen scraps. And also disadvantage, I mean, you can't keep it there forever. You need to empty it somewhere, so you'll need some sort of garden, even if it's just a small one. Let's see how it works. Actually, how it works, let's go back here. All you do is you collect your kitchen scraps every day. At the end of the day, you put them into that bucket, you lift off the lid, you put them in, and then with something like a potato masher, you really chomp them down. Just make sure it's nice and firmly packed, and then you put in a small amount of your Bokashi mix. Instructions are there, or with the spray, you just spray it over there, and then you're inoculating it with the start of the fermentation process. You put the lid back on. The next day, you get your kitchen scraps, you repeat the process, put it in, clump it all down, put a bit of Bokashi mix on it, and so on, until the bucket is full. In the meantime, we're starting to get this liquid that comes out. You can see that's usually brown colour. And it's a liquid leachate. You dilute it as a fertiliser. And when I say dilute it, it's like 2 or 3 teaspoons per litre of water. It's very, very strong, but very, very good. And the fermented stuff that's in the middle there, so this is looking at the bucket once it's almost full. It doesn't look like anything really that has happened to it. You might get a layer of white mold over the top, and that's fine. That's just part of the fermentation process. But once it's full, you need to leave it for 7 days to a week. Seven to 10 days, and then you put it into your soil. So here's where you need to put a trench into your soil, or you dig little holes every here and there around your soil. You put some of that in there, you cover it up with soil all over again, and that will very quickly break down. So out of the soil, it's just staying there as a fermented product. Can't see much change. Put it in the soil and it breaks down. And those worms come from miles away to eat that stuff. They love it. So it takes about 2 weeks. You can go and dig over it and it's gone. You won't see it anymore. Unless perhaps you put in something like an avocado pip in there. But other things will break down quite quickly. So it adds organic matter to your soil right there and then, as well as being quite high in fertilizer value, and the worms come through too. That's it in a nutshell for Bokashi. One of the disadvantages of it though is that when you put it out into your garden, remember I said it's got a very slight smell. If you've got a dog, your dog's going to want to know what that slight smell is, so they'll start to dig it up. So what I do is, after I've covered it with soil, before I plant into it, because can't quite plant for another 2 weeks, I'll cover it again with, I've got some, even just an old bed sheet or something, shade cloth, whatever it might be, and maybe, clamp down the edges or put some bricks on the edges so the dog can't get in there and dig it all up. And then once it's broken down, they won't be interested, the smell is gone. But it works quite well. You could also empty this into your compost bin, but it's really, really high in nitrogen, so you would have to balance it with lots of the brown stuff as well. So just in summary, and then I'll take a few last questions. Which method best suits your household? I use all three, but then I'm a bit of a compost waste reduction freak. But I just love doing this sort of stuff. So composting, if you've got a large household, lots of people in your household, and you've got a garden in which to put at least 2 compost bins in there. So you're going to have a garden in order to get this one happening. A worm farm is only suitable if you're using that alone, if you're a small household, 1 to 2 people really. Otherwise you're creating too many scraps and the worms won't be able to get through them quickly enough. You can do it if you've got no garden too. That vermicast or even that liquid stuff is fine for potted plants, but also you can take it to veggie swaps and people will take it from your hands quite happily. And then the Bokashi, there's one of the buckets with the grain there. It could be small or a large household, but you will need some sort of garden in which to get rid of your Bokashi scraps. Or someone who's got a garden, because my daughter, when she first moved out, took a Bokashi bucket with her, and I was quite happy to take her scraps from her after she'd finished in the Bokashi bucket. So which suits you? It could be a combination of some of them, or could you just one alongside your Fogo bin to take all those other items that really aren't suitable for this composting systems. But if you've got a garden or even just some potted plants, being able to use what you've made on site rather than having to go out to buy fertilizers or buy soil conditioners or manures and things, you're making them. And that's the aim, really, trying to close the loop in your garden in order to be fantastically sustainable. I'll leave that there and I'll take any last minute questions if there are, or from any of the other topics before.
Yes,
yeah.
there are a few. Is it better to put into a trench rather than a compost?
The Bokashi, yes. The reason is when it breaks down in your soil, it's adding a lot of organic matter, but if you put it into your compost bin, it's going to break down a lot more and you won't get as much organic matter out of it. So the Bokashi people always say it's far better to trench. It might not even be a trench, just might be a hole here and there if you haven't got a whole space to put a whole trench of stuff. Just, you dig a trowel load of soil out, put some in and cover it with soil over again, just in pockets around your veggie patches, for example. But yeah, trenching is probably better.
Thank you. If you had the wicking bed and put the worm feast in, can you also put in the bokashi mix, as the garden bed will only have the compost worms?
Absolutely, yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, your worms will love it there. Yeah, sure.
Thank you. And can you have plants near the bokashi mix?
You can, but just if you're digging a trench or digging holes, you just want to avoid disturbing their roots.
Sure.
And plant roots go a lot further than what we anticipate, what we might think. But
Thank
yeah, you
you.
can. Yeah.
Are there any non-worm options that are suitable for apartments?
Oh, your Bokashi. Bokashi is definitely suitable, but you'll need to have somewhere to empty the Bokashi bucket. You could empty it into your Fogo bin if you really wanted to, but that's a waste. You might as well give it to someone who's got a garden. Right, so, yeah, your non-worm options would be your Bokashi, definitely. And Bokashi comes from Japan, and they live in apartments. So this is the methods that they're using. I don't know where they empty them, but it's a Japanese sort of method of
Well,
waste disposal.
thank you. If there are no worms in my soil, doesn't mean that my soil is not fertile, and so can I buy worm wheat and use it in my garden?
Uh, yeah, I don't know if you can buy wormweed. I'm not sure that you can because remember, it's the shelf life of it isn't fantastic. Now, if you haven't got worms in your garden, your best thing to do is add organic matter in the form of compost or even other manures. Sometimes, also, if the soil is too hot at the top, the worms will be deeper. But it's just lovely if you go into your garden, you're sort of not doing big digging, but just tickling around the soil and you find worms in there. Yep, that's great. Your soil's nice and fertile. So the best way of getting worms into your soil is to add organic matter. They will come and come into your garden if you've got lovely organic matter in there, in the form of compost, for example, or cow manure or something that you buy. But no, wormweed, no.
Thank you. Does does Bokashi attract rats or mice, or best to add back to compost heap?
Yeah, look, they might again because of the smell. So that's why I do like to put something over the top and clamp it down just to stop them coming. Yeah, it probably would. They'll dig it up. Yeah, yeah.
This looks like a faster process to add fertile soil. Is that correct?
Bokashi is faster. So the Bokashi people, the people who put it out, say that the average family of four will fill up a bin in a month. All right, and then you need to wait 7 to 10 days before you put it into your soil. So yes, it is much faster. Now, if you're the sort of family that doesn't buy fruit and veg, frozen in packets, and you peel your own and you process your own, you probably fill up your bucket a lot faster in 1 month. So, yep, it is faster, absolutely, than making compost. Yep.
Thank you. And I think as a last one, do worms like spent coffee grains?
Yes, they do. They do. Just don't put too much at once, okay? Because they're quite acidic, also, the coffee grounds. Yeah. Yeah, just go easy on them.
Sure. And one last one. What does organic matter mean to soil?
Okay, so organic matter, so anything that came from something that was once living, that's considered organic matter. As that breaks down, that further breaks down into this stuff called humus, spelled Humus. And humus allows it's the go between the minerals that are naturally in soil and your plant's roots. Your plant's roots can't always get to those minerals. They're not in an accessible form. But if you've got humus in your soil that's come from that organic matter breaking down, that allows those plants' roots to take up those minerals and so grow much more healthy. That's what organic matter is. That's why that's there. So
Thank you.
a soil that doesn't have organic matter will have very stunted growth. Your plants just won't grow that well.
Sure. Okay. I think that's the last of the questions. So thank you so much, Maria, for your great webinar tonight. I've definitely learned a lot, and people can find you on your website, which is My Green Garden.
That's right.
Um,
.com.au. Yep, yep. And there's
yes.
lots of composting stuff on there too. So you get some videos and so on. So look, I hope you have the confidence to go out and do what you know, to really make a difference in your garden and environmentally as well, but make a difference in your garden to really have healthy, thriving plants and soil as well, because that's where it all begins.